Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. I'm sure many of you, if not most of you by now, have heard of that epic shadow drop release of a game called HiFi Rush. I was watching the Xbox Direct in January 2023, and honestly, for the most part, I wasn't that keen on what I was seeing. But I dare say I was very pleased to see that Tango Gameworks was on the menu. I don't know about you guys, but I've been a major fan of Tango Gameworks since the beginning. I mean, how could you not be? Shinji Mikami founded the studio back in 2010, and his reputation as a game developer is legend. He's responsible for working on some of the most influential games of all time. The man was a game director at Capcom for the original Resident Evil game back in 1996. That alone puts him in the video game history books. He also directed Dino Crisis and produced most, if not all, early era Resident Evil games, as well as producing Devil May Cry and Beautiful Joe. While still at Capcom, he is responsible for writing and directing Resident Evil 4, one of the most celebrated and influential games of all time. We would not have third-person shooters as we know them today were it not for this vital pillar in video game history. He's also directed a few cult classics such as God Hand and Vanquish. Forgive the momentary detour from the review, but I do think it's important to take a bit of time to outline the creative foundation that Tango Gameworks was built on. Even though they haven't released that many games thus far, they do have a solid catalog that paints a promising future. I personally love the Evil Within series, a new survival horror franchise that I think is one of my favorites of the entire last decade. As a side note, Mikami was a director on the first Evil Within project, but since then has hung up his cape as a director. He's done this so new creative talent can grow at Tango Gameworks. So instead, now he fulfills his role as an executive producer on all future projects. We'll see if ever he picks up the reins once again as a director. Anyway, great start for the studio, but I'd say 2022 was not their best year. Ghostwire Tokyo was a highly anticipated game that took quite a while to come to fruition, and personally for my part, I was rather disappointed. Not a terrible game by any means, there are a bunch of cool ideas, no doubt. But they are plagued by these tedious open world ideas that we've seen 1,000 times before, really mirroring those cookie cutter Ubisoft formulas. And the enemies are equally repetitive, and the side quests themselves are shockingly paper thin. And it also doesn't help that as a horror game, it just wasn't scary at all. Overall, it just felt empty, especially when it comes to the open world, and underdeveloped. Its main redeeming quality was that the game looked beautiful. There are some very cool aesthetic and stylistic ideas that they play around here. But overall, I wouldn't see myself giving it more than a 6 out of 10. Moving on, in 2022, they also released a game called Hero Dice, a game that I've never heard of before, and a game that also shut down 5 months after launch. All this history lesson to bring us back to 2023. At the Xbox Direct, honestly, I was expecting to get the Evil Within 3. I mean, we are due for a third installment. The last game came out back in 2017, and I'm still hoping to see a third game eventually. But never in a million years did I expect a project like HiFi Rush, let alone to have it announced and released the same day on the Xbox Game Pass. It's such a shock to the system because it's so wildly unlike anything Tango Gameworks has done thus far. There is nothing horror or dark about it. It is the polar opposite. I didn't know what to expect with this game, but I gave it a shot. And my first impressions were glowing. I was aware of the cel-shaded art direction look of HiFi Rush from the Xbox Direct, but I seriously underestimated the artistic power of this game. The intro cinematic alone features some of the best cartoon animations I've ever seen in a game. I was genuinely taken aback by all the charisma and confidence of everything on screen. I literally restarted the game instantly to call my girlfriend over to check it out now. I was also pleased by how smooth the controls were at first glance. But before getting too deep into the game's review, I think it's worth taking a moment to just highlight just how much of an insane genre mix this game is. Imagine a perfect fusion between games like Sunset Overdrive, Jet Set Radio, Ratchet & Clank, Guitar Hero, Devil May Cry, and even a splash of Persona. The whole game feels like one of those palaces on steroids. Perhaps it's not the most original game out there, but it more than makes up for in execution and style. And on that note, the game absolutely oozes with style. This goes way beyond the cel-shaded art direction, which is excellent. What really makes this game stand out from every other game under the sun is that everything in this world grooves to the beating heart of this game's rhythm. That would be Chai's foot tapping, his finger snapping, the blinking lights in the environment, the trees in the environment, even the enemy attacks. Absolutely everything is 100% on beat. It's a wild idea that from a distance seems simply gimmicky and rather overwhelming, but once you're actually in the throes of gameplay, it's perfectly immersing and super engaging. It's simply enthralling to find yourself in the flow of the rhythm and landing your attacks perfectly on beat. Not only do you get bonus points for landing the attacks on beat, but you also get bonus damage. And it's not just your attacks that can land on the beat. Even something like jumping or dodges applies. I deeply admire the team's dedication to pull this off so consistently across the entire gameplay experience. Truly, there isn't a single aspect of the game's presentation that hasn't gotten a mountain load of love that supports the game's unique quirks, to the point that it would just be considered absolutely overkill in every other game. Even something as mundane as resuming your game from the main menu, something that we just never think about, has gotten its unique twist in this game. Even the in-game achievement tracker has gotten a very cute and artistic twist to it. To add, a dizzying amount of comic book love has been infused into HiFi Rush. In many ways, this feels like the perfect Scott Pilgrim video game. Doubtless, yet another massive inspiration that was added into the genre madness blender. Honestly, 10 out of 10 presentation quality in this game. As for the game's structure, it's a traditional single-player linear level-based game with regular pockets of exploration where you can find more currency to collect or find rare upgrade pieces for your max health and so forth. It's nothing we haven't seen before and honestly kind of makes me nostalgic for the good old days of gaming. I'm looking at you, Banjo-Tooie. I mean, that's my personal childhood favorite, but there's no shortage of examples you can replace it with. Anyways, the exploration was always fun and rewarding. It's never overly challenging, but it always manages to be engaging. Though I do think the greatest pleasure comes from simply exploring the visual wonders of this world and the design choices taken. There's some truly outstanding level art in this game that I dare say, even much later into the year, we will be remembering them very fondly. My personal favorite has to be the museum. To further continue on the world building, the narrative arc isn't something that will revolutionize everything we knew about video games. That being said, the writing is rock solid. Even the admittedly cheesy dialogue doesn't bother me nearly as much as it normally would. The execution is the absolute best it could possibly be. It perfectly captures that Saturday morning cartoon vibe that I had in my childhood days. Yeah, when I think about it, this game has a major nostalgic vibe that it's playing on, and I'm sure that's one of the major factors why people have been so receptive to this game. The game is also genuinely funny. Chai, our protagonist, is a lovable dope with a heart of gold, and the rest of the cast is equally endearing. Without going to spoilers, Cinnamon is a personal favorite of mine. I think it's super clever what the animators did with this character. Honestly, top marks to them. High five. And before I forget, the voice acting are perfect for the roles, even if their characters do lack a bit of depth. And beyond the comedy of the writing and the characters themselves, there's plenty of clever and rather subtle level design details that are easy to miss, but that had me laughing time and again. Also, don't avoid those optional dialogues with the generic robot NPCs in the world. They do little to advance the story, but there's quite a lot of comedic gold to be found. As a final note on the game's comedy, there's so many unnecessary details added into the game that perfectly support the game's tone and flavor that honestly you will probably miss. For example, if you decide to just leave the game and go back to the break room right before the game's final climax, you will have funny reactions from your friends. The game is chock full of these kind of wonderful attention to details that break the fourth wall. As for the villains, they are rather generic, but are so sassy and flashy. Any depth they lack narratively, they make up for in spades in spectacle. So yes, of course there are boss fights in this game, and they are exhilarating to behold. Those Scott Pilgrim vibes I mentioned earlier are on full display here, mixing comic madness in both gameplay and cinematic. They are so charismatic in their presentation, and they're genuinely a lot of fun to battle. Perhaps it is a bit early to be calling it, but I imagine that some of these boss fights will be fondly remembered by the end of the year. If there are any other boss fights coming up later this year to match or surpass these, by all means do so. I must say I am surprised with how deep and engaging the combat is in this game. Not only did I think the rhythm-based gameplay would feel gimmicky, at least at a first glance from that announcement video from the Xbox Direct, but I also worried that the hack and slash gameplay would get repetitive. Luckily, not for one moment was I bored, and there are several factors that play into that. For one, there's a solid character progression in the game. I won't spoil all the details, of course, but there are some truly creative moves that you can unlock in this game rather than a generic stat upgrade. This is yet another testament to the devs' explosive creativity on display. I love all the synergies you can chain between your different abilities. It's super satisfying to pull off and eye-poppingly entertaining. I'm equally impressed with the wide range of enemy variety in HiFi Rush. They don't play all that differently from each other, but it goes a long way to keep the game fresh. Though I think my favorite part about them was that they felt so much more than just cannon fodder. I can't tell you how many times they're using cinematics before or after combat to great comedic effect. It's one of the most exciting use of basic enemies I've seen in a game's narrative in quite a long time. Finally, there's a decent amount of variety in the pacing you'll experience in HiFi Rush. As expected, you'll jump between combat arenas and third-person platforming exploration. Sometimes you'll switch to 2D exploration, and other times you'll be in these chase-like sequences. And of course, don't forget about all the boss fights and cinematic and a few other surprises sprinkled throughout the roughly 10-hour campaign. HiFi Rush is a game that is consistently engaging from beginning until the last second. As for the music, perhaps it's not something I would listen to on my own time, but within the game's context, it is an absolutely killer soundtrack. This applies for both the original soundtrack made for the game, which perfectly suits the colorful and over-the-top tone of the game, and the inclusion of a lot of famous alternative rock songs was a really nice touch. Of course, I won't spoil it for you guys because as an avid music lover, it was a lot of fun to discover these for myself. But I was super pleased to hear one rather obscure alternative rock song that I haven't listened to in quite a while. Well, at least I think it's obscure. I know like 3 or 4 people who listen to Swan. If you're a Smashing Pumpkins fan and you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, go listen to Swan. What a blast from the past. Anyway, the point is the soundtrack rocks, literally. So it's pretty obvious that I'm head over heels in love with this game, but for the sake of constructive criticism, let's go over a few points that I feel are weaker. Let's start off on the narrative front, arguably one of the weaker, if not the weakest aspect of the game, even if the execution is as good as it could possibly be with the material at hand. Still, I find it terribly predictable. There are no plot twists that you don't see coming a mile away, and the character development is rather paper thin. Its saving grace is that the writing is so witty, the performance is so lively, and the game's so much damn fun that it's so easy to look past these kind of weaknesses. I think for kids and young adults, it would be most suitable, the kind of narrative, but for my part, I do look for deeper and more thought-provoking narrative experiences. Additionally, there is a plethora of optional text you can find in the game that honestly I felt never really added anything meaningful to the world building. Frankly, for the most part, I felt they were kind of irrelevant. And finally, some of the jokes are just too goofy to my liking. There are some real eye rollers here. Next, I do have a few points to bring up on the gameplay front. First, the platforming feels kind of clumsy. This is the classic issue in third-person platforms because honestly it's kind of hard to read the metrics due to the camera angle and the perceived distance. And it doesn't help that a lot of these platforms are in motion as well. But even if they are static, I found myself in many situations where I would double jump, not quite reach the destination, and then use a dash to cover the distance and only to fall into the abyss. This happens more often than it should. But even the 2D sections can be confusing. There's one instance in particular near the end of the game where the camera was unnaturally far to the right and maybe on a bit of an angle, made readability of the space kind of confusing. I'll be honest, this is the exception to the rule. The next point, however, is perhaps the one that frustrated me the most in the game. Okay, minor spoilers here, but there's an ability you unlock later in the game that I consistently struggled to pull off. That will be the macro abilities you use to progress in the levels. And you do need to use these because you literally hit a brick wall. Literally. I found the readability of the timing ring pretty hard to gauge, and actually the first few times I didn't even notice it was there. Which reminds me that at times there isn't information and color overload on the screen. It can get seriously tough to figure out what the hell is going on from time to time. Anyway, my trick was to avoid the actual circle timing and to focus on the feedback from Chai himself. Once I put that practice to use, I was pulling off the move every single time, which makes me wonder, perhaps the feedback on the timing ring was defective. What's particularly frustrating is that when you would miss your timing for the ability, there would be a short cancel animation before you could try the move again. But what's even weirder is that each time you would have to reposition Chai because initiating the move would kind of like displace Chai a meter or two away from where he initially was. So it's super annoying to start the move, miss the move, wait, reposition fiddle about with Chai, try again, and then miss and repeat this process over and over like 4 or 5 times in a row. And just for the record, I am perfectly open to the idea that perhaps I'm the idiot in this scenario and I can't get my timing right. It's possible that you guys would just like slap me with a get good meme, and maybe I deserve it. But this issue really got highlighted for me in a specific chase sequence where I had to pull this move off immediately. And because I did fail the sequence, I'd have to start the entire chase over from the beginning. It's literally the only move in the entire game that gave me a consistent headache like that. Luckily, when you do get the move right, it packs a punch, literally. To branch off into a somewhat similar topic, there are a few forced timing sequences that you must succeed to be able to progress in the story, which honestly kind of recall those Guitar Hero moments in the game. And honestly, they can be pretty damn hard to pull off. Contrary to the rest of the game where if you miss your timing, well, you just get a score penalty. Here, everything comes to a screeching halt, and you have to start the whole thing over from the beginning. And some of these challenges can be quite lengthy, honestly. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm not much of a musician, despite what you may think with that guitar that you see back there. So these sequences were hard for me. If you're some Guitar Hero god, then you won't struggle. But if you're an average Joe like me, I won't be surprised if you'll be rather frustrated and be retrying the sequence like 20-30 times. Honestly, for some of them, that happened to me. I honestly wonder if this could become a complete blocker for some players, because it is a 100% flow killer that brings the game to a screeching halt in an otherwise sublime pacing experience in HiFi Rush. I think I've exhausted everything I had to say about this game. I wonder if my initial and glowing impressions would hold out to the end. I initially worried that it wouldn't, so I'm genuinely shocked at just how goddamn cool this game is and how it continued to surprise and delight me throughout the entire gameplay experience. The story may be rather shallow and the gameplay doesn't really reinvent the wheel, but damn if this isn't a near perfect execution. There's something so refreshing about a game that just shadow drops out of nowhere to become this gaming sensation. It's so refreshing to see a game that doesn't need to oversell itself with marketing. This is just a simple, hey, we made something cool, check it out. Therefore, I am adding my voice to the screaming crowd of fans cheering HiFi Rush onwards. I am giving it a rocking 9 out of 10. Honestly, this is an early Game of the Year contender. Who would have thought the game would have turned out this good and would have had this great of a game this early in the year? And that is all for today. I don't know where you are, but it's damn cold in Montreal this weekend. Anyways, as always, wishing you and your family nothing but warmth this weekend. Take care and talk to you all very soon.